Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Now, another new feature introduced relatively recently in Squarespace is courses. So you go under products, there's blog, and I've already got a blog there where I put articles and so forth. You can see you can also put up video on demand, but you can also easily now set up a course. So here's a template. So we're just going to use this as a test, and we'll select the first template. And you can see that automatically generates a course page. And this is, of course, paywalled. So obviously you'd be charging for this. And as you can see here, this is the layout of the first template. You can choose the other template, or you can do it yourself, alter it, etc. That's all fairly easy. And you can see it comes pre-populated with some examples of what it would look like. So there's your embedded video. And then you can download a PDF of the course. There you can put additional resource links, etc., etc. So, of course, you can charge for this. You can set however much you want to charge for a course. You could make it free. Obviously, there's the public preview bit up there as well, and provide additional materials with those download options. So there's the charging page, for instance. Quite useful if you have a skill or experience you want to pass on online and make a bit of money off of. So, new feature. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Well, it's been a while since I covered some of my trip to Australia last year, so I thought let's catch up a little bit on that with another video from the wonderful city of Melbourne. I know some Australians might disagree with that assessment, but, well, as you can see, while I was there, the weather was exceptionally nice, and a rather wonderful Australian subscriber, as I mentioned in a previous video from Melbourne, was very happy to drive us around. So what you can see panning past you at the moment is, in fact, the entrance to Melbourne Harbour, and we're quite a distance from the city itself. You might be able to see it towards the end of the pan over there on the other side of the bay, and the extremely unfortunate poor old high-riding grain carrier there that's just coming out. Well, let's just say he was having a little bit of bobbing and weaving as he fought his way out the entrance on this particular day. But nonetheless, the point of this video is to highlight two rather interesting wrecked vessels that can be found in Melbourne or the immediate vicinity thereof. Now, at this stage, this video is going to be looking mostly at the wrecks. We'll briefly cover the ship's service lives, but I do have a separate video on the full service life and career of HMVS Cerberus at some point. Spoiler alert as to which one of the wrecks is. And the other vessel, which is a submarine, also as a class and as an individual ship, has a rather interesting history, which again will merit a further long in-depth video at some point in the future. But with all that said, let's have a look at what you can find if you know where to look in Melbourne. First off, let's look at HMAS J7. At the start of the First World War, the Royal Navy's submarine fleet was fairly extensive, but a lot of the designs were what you might nowadays call effectively coastal subs, although they did go a bit further than that. Ships in the region of around a few hundred tons displacement. There were some somewhat bigger vessels that were under mass production, the E-class, but even they were 600-700 tons displacement or so. But a whole slew of reports had been reaching the Royal Navy about the capabilities of German U-boats, Germany being a somewhat latecomer to the submarine party in actual fact, but nonetheless, as the way of immediately pre-war and then wartime rumours went, one of the various rumours was of an extremely high-speed German submarine. And one of the many submarine programs that was initiated was the J-class. Now, unfortunately, for those of you who like easy references, British submarine design in World War II didn't follow a nice alphabetical sequence. Well, it does up until around about the E-class, and then it just goes all over the place. Nonetheless, the idea of the J-class was to try and match this hypothetical and, as it turned out, non-existent German U-boat, and in order to do so, they designed a very large submarine. In fact, it was on a par size-wise with some of the earlier US interwar fleet boats. And Like the fleet boats, it was actually originally intended as a fleet submarine with a speed to keep up with the battle fleet. The idea to provide the power was simply to take an existing diesel engine design, which had a rating of 100 horsepower per cylinder, and which had previously been installed in 6 and 8 cylinder versions on previous Royal Navy subs, and just stick extra cylinders on the engine block. Therefore, logically, this should give a much greater power output. That part kind of worked. The problem was that even with the amount of power that was now being pushed through the subs, around 3,600 horsepower on the surface, they still couldn't reach the 21-knot top speed of the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet. They could manage around about 19 knots, which, to be fair, was still quite an impressive achievement for a early to mid-World War I era submarine, but still fell far short of actually being able to keep up with said battle fleet. But a happy side effect of the ostensible failure of the J-class program was the fact you now had a fairly heavily armed submarine with a large number of torpedo tubes for a World War I era sub that was still capable of relatively high speed on the surface and, of course, had a significant amount of endurance. In fact, this is pretty much the same thing that happened with US fleet submarines in the run-up to World War II. Although they could keep up with the interwar battle fleet, by the time the actual water came around, they couldn't keep up with the fast ships, but they still had high firepower, high speed, and long-distance endurance. And this meant that the J-class, like the US fleet subs, were quickly dispatched to hunt enemy warships away from the main friendly battle forces. Of course, unlike Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany didn't really have a huge merchant fleet going on the surface, and so the J-class found themselves mostly hunting enemy warships. And in this respect, their greatest successes came when HMS J2 managed to torpedo and sink U-99 while it was transiting on the surface, and J1 managed to torpedo both the Großer Kurfürst and the Kronprinz, two German battleships, with the same salvo. She fired her full 4-bow torpedo tube salvo, and 2 torpedoes hit, one on each German vessel. The ships also had a pair of beam torpedoes, but J1 didn't fire those in that particular engagement. About the only real downside to the J-class, apart from their size making them somewhat expensive, was that their failure to reach the 21-knot target speed was what inspired the K-class, the rather interesting failure of a ship powered by steam turbines whilst also trying to be a submarine. Well, we've got a video on that separately, so go have a look at that. But as the war came to an end, the Royal Navy faced a bit of a conundrum. They had an awful lot of submarines, and they had to clear out a whole bunch of them. Most of the old ones were quite easy, but when it came to their larger and newer subs, it was a lot more difficult to make their decision. Ideally, they wanted to retain submarines armed with 21-inch torpedoes, the new standard. However, only some submarines fit that standard, albeit one of them was the fairly widely produced L-class, which were a little bit smaller than the J-class, but still relatively substantial. But with the J-class being somewhat expensive to maintain, since there were only 5 of them left, as J6 had been sunk in a friendly fire incident, and with them having only the smaller 18-inch torpedo tubes and not meeting their overall design objectives, while the K-class were mostly armed with 18-inch torpedo tubes, they did, at least when they worked, hit a speed that could keep up with the battle fleet. And so the J-class were earmarked for disposal. But at the same time, the Royal Navy became aware that the Royal Australian Navy was trying to get some better subs for itself. They had a couple of smaller E-types, but one of those had sunk pretty early, and in any case the E-type didn't have either the range or the speed to be really useful in the large open ocean environments surrounding Australia. And so both parties had a bit of a brainwave. The Royal Navy was looking to dispose of some relatively large, high-speed submarines with extensive range, which just so happened to be what the Australians were trying to get hold of, and thus the J-class were transferred in their entirety over to the Royal Australian Navy, beginning something of an epic voyage in April 1919, along with a depot ship, which took them about 3 months via the Suez Canal before they fetched up in Sydney. Now, having just travelled half a planet at the tail end of some fairly extensive wartime use, the subs were in need of something of a deep overhaul as soon as they got there, and this began to be undertaken. Now, in a case of one of these things is not like the others, as you can see here with J1, the regular J-class had a fairly forward-mounted conning tower and sail setup, with a deck gun mounted on said sail. But J7, last of the class, experimented a little with a semi-faired breastwork, which was hoped to improve hydrodynamics, but this meant moving the conning tower about 60 feet further aft, so it was set aft of the amidships point, and this distinguished her from the rest of the class. However, while this did seem to offer a very capable core for the new Royal Australian Navy submarine force, problems arose almost immediately. The cost of refitting all the subs hadn't initially been factored in, but also naval budgets were being cut quite significantly in the aftermath of World War I, and suddenly the Royal Australian Navy discovered it wasn't being given anywhere near enough money to afford all the ships that it had. This would result in a rather rapid downsizing of the Royal Australian Navy, the battlecruiser HMAS Australia being another victim of this and other factors. But the Navy wasn't that keen on getting rid of a submarine class that actually represented something it wanted, so initially they tried to argue to put all the subs in reserve except for J7, which was in the best condition, and then they would run a simple program with submarine crews rotating through J7, hoping that at some point more funding would be forthcoming. Unfortunately, this and the general idea of more funding in anything like the near future was rejected, and so the subs had to be sold off almost as soon as they were ready for service, after a huge amount of money had been spent on getting them ready for service, but nobody said political decisions were particularly wise. 4 of the submarines were scuttled in the Bass Strait, and you can dive them with scuba gear. J3 was scuttled as a breakwater off Swan Island, which is near the entrance to Melbourne Harbour, also known as Port Phillip, and you can see her from Swan Island, or if you have a small boat, go out and inspect her, as she is still above the water partially. However, J7, the last to be disposed of, was sunk as a breakwater at the Sandringham Yacht Club, and that is where I went back in June 2023, and here's what's left of her. Now, unlike J3, she was partially dismantled, so the conning tower and the fairing, etc. is gone, although you can see traces of what's left. And of course, being a yacht club, you can't just walk in there, you do have to make an appointment or know someone who's a member, but it is possible to visit the wreck. Now, as for why the wreck is still there, the yacht club and its marina have expanded quite considerably since she was sunk there, but it was far too expensive to actually relocate the wreck, so they've just kind of built around it, and hence you can walk along and just look at it. Or in my case, walk around it, photograph it, have a look at it, and then put a drone up and have a look at it from overhead in glorious 4K. Now, I know this video has been rendered in 1080p, but if anybody wants copies of the 4K footage and the 4K pictures, especially, of course, if you happen to be researching the J-Class, then feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to send it to you. Now, as you saw from the diving planes back there, she is on a roughly even keel, not 100%, but there is also definitely a direction from which the wind and what wet waves enter the marina have affected her somewhat more than the other. And of course, bear in mind that what you're primarily looking at is the remains of the casing and the ballast tanks. You can actually see there the core, the pressure hull, is, well, at least at exterior visual inspection, in relatively good shape. Now, as I said, she was partially dismantled before she was sold as a breakwater, and therefore some parts of her internal fixtures and fittings will have been removed, as well as some of the exterior stuff. And I have no idea what the rules and regulations are about actually accessing the interior. That's something you'd have to discuss with the yacht club, and I suspect they probably want someone with, proper qualifications looking to do serious archaeology, but I think it probably could be done. She's relatively stable. She's enclosed in a marina. It's not like the wreck's going to shift suddenly, So it might make an interesting bit of exploration for someone, as I said, with the proper qualifications and equipment, or perhaps with a small underwater drone. I'd probably recommend access via that gap you just saw, which I think is where the sail used to be. There are, of course, some external remnants of various bits of pipework for carrying high-pressure air and or water to various parts of the sub while she was in active service. But I would genuinely be interested to see how much survives internally, particularly of the torpedo tubes and other fancy gear and equipment. Of course, huge thanks to the Sandringham Yacht Club for actually letting me in and letting me do the filming, although of course, as you can probably tell from the tight view, they were fairly particular about not really showing off much else of the marina, which is perfectly fine. And also, shout out, just in case they see it, to the poor bemused yachtsman who was a couple of walkways over, who was really thoroughly confused as to why a bunch of random Brits had shown up and were showing great interest in the rusted out old hulk that he walks by every time he comes down to the marina, but there you go. And while, of course, the wreck is gradually decaying, it's probably decaying at a much slower rate than almost any other wreck in a similar position of being partially submerged off the coastline somewhere, because, as I say, she is in this sheltered position in the marina where everything stays relatively calm. Now, we've had a look at J7 and have said if you want to see more pictures of the wreck or more video from the wreck, then just drop me a line and I'm happy to send you all the relevant files. But of course I mentioned there is another wreck over in Melbourne. So let's have a look at that one. And this one is far more publicly accessible, even if you can only look at it from a distance, unless you happen to have a boat and permission to go up close. I think that's how it works anyway. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Melbourne residents. As I believe some mentioned at the time that people used to swim out to the wreck all the time. I don't know if it's more protected nowadays than it was. And that is, of course, the wreck of HMVS Cerberus, a very early breastwork monitor-coast defence ship. Now, I have done a 5-minute guide on Cerberus, so if you want the 5-minute guide treatment, you can go and have a look at that. But briefly, and perhaps looking at a wider context, Cerberus was designed in the mid-1860s as the various states that made up the landmass that is now a single country, Australia, were worried to varying degrees about potential incursions from hostile powers, primarily the Russians, who did have a force in the Pacific. Now, back at home, the Royal Navy was building a few turret ships, as well as central battery ironclads and broadside ironclads, but even the turreted vessels at this point still had sails, which required quite an interesting compromise in the way that the turrets were laid out and how the hull as a whole was designed. However, the Victorian government, as in the government of the state of Victoria, rather than the British government that happened to be in the Victorian time period, didn't need a ship that could go on long voyages across the ocean other than to get from where it was built to its new home. They just needed essentially a floating gun battery to defend Melbourne Harbour, aka Port Phillip Bay, which was the capital of the state of Victoria. Still is, for that matter. And so, without the need for sails, something that in some ways actually looks a little bit like an ironclad era pre-dreadnought could be designed. Because of the sheer weight of turrets, which is something that we've covered relatively recently, the ship couldn't have a particularly high freeboard, but a particularly high freeboard wasn't necessary, again, for coast defence. And so taking a few lessons as well from the American Civil War, which at the time that Cerberus was conceived was in the process of dying down, but still an ongoing concern, she was given an initial armament of 2 turrets, each armed with a pair of 10-inch rifled muzzle-loading guns, with her hull and primary breastwork and turrets all covered in thick layers of iron armour, up to 8 inches thick on the belt, up to 9 inches thick on the breastwork. That's, in this picture, that kind of white stripe section that makes up the lower superstructure, and up to 10 inches thick on the turrets, all backed up by teak to prevent spalling and to help spread the shock load. She was also actually a semi-submersible, as she could allow water into ballast tanks which would then submerge the hull, again, the black portion you can see at the bottom of the ship there, which would mean she could move around with just the breastwork and the turret showing. And of course, that had more armor on it, as well as being a somewhat smaller target. To improve her seakeeping and avoid the fate of USS Monitor while she was voyaging on the high seas to make it all the way to her new home, additional breastwork was built up at the edge of the hull and sails were fitted, but these were only temporary arrangements and stripped off pretty much as soon as she got there. In her designed role for the period, she was pretty much ideal. There was very little on the planet that could force its way into the harbour while the coast defences were operating and this thing was prowling, as she'd very rapidly make short work of pretty much any cruiser and not a few ironclad battleships. And as time went on, she was given additional equipment, torpedo netting on booms once torpedoes became a viable thing, and then, because torpedoes usually came on torpedo boats, she was also given a series of lighter weight quick-firing and automatic weapons to deal with them should they appear. You can just about see the booms for those torpedo nets in this picture taken in 1917. They're the diagonal black lines you can see poking up from the hull across the face of the breastwork. However, of course, time wound on and technology improved, and she was obsolete before the end of the 19th century. That didn't mean that she wasn't useful, though. She was initially repurposed in the last decade of the 19th century as a store ship, and then once she became HMAS Cerberus, as the various Australian states federated into the Federation of Australia, she was used as a guard ship, a munition ship, and then, interestingly, she was renamed HMAS Platypus II and became a submarine tender to the J-class submarines, of which we've just seen J7's wreck, not too far away from her, still in Melbourne. But all good things have to come to an end, and with the retirement of the J-class, as we mentioned earlier in the video, there wasn't any justification for keeping her around, and Cerberus was sold for scrap in 1924. And in an interesting parallel again with J7, she was partially salvaged by the scrappers and then sold on for use as a breakwater by a yacht club. And then, as a result of this, she was scuttled in Half Moon Bay, which is where she remains to this day. And here she is, much more accessible. You just have to drive down to the local pier and then just walk along the pier and you can see her, or in my case, stand on the pier, take a few photos, which you saw a minute ago, and then send the drone out to have a look as well. Now, one thing that will be immediately obvious, there's me on the pier, wave, is that she is in a state of decay. You know, she has gradually rusted away. You'll notice she doesn't have the guns in the turrets anymore. Those have been removed, treated, and placed alongside the wreck. And if you're wondering about why that orbit was a little bit quick, well, as you can probably tell from the waves, although it wasn't the windiest you can get in the area, it was still relatively windy, and the drone I took to Australia was relatively small, so it was, shall we say, struggling a little bit at times. Nonetheless, as we do a bit of a zoom up, you can also see the hull generally is there, not just the breastwork, which you can see above the water. The breastwork and the turrets and the funnel are all that's left above the water. The superstructure has been mostly salvaged, obviously, before she was used as a breakwater. But she is ultimately an example of Victorian engineering, and so, again, for a wreck that's basically been left to rot away for the most part, she's in remarkably good condition, even if that condition isn't all that great. You can see the seabirds seem to like using her as a perch as well. Now, there is an organisation that looks to try and preserve Cerberus as best they can, and they are the ones who recovered the guns because her decking collapsed, and so it was realised, well, these big heavy guns are probably not doing it any favours. But while many people have asked in various comments of various videos, well, what about preserving the ship, as in removing her, reconditioning her, putting her on display a bit like they've done to Mary Rose or bits of Monitor? I would say it is possible to do in theory. However, while she hasn't been in the water for quite as long as Monitor, and therefore you could look at the recovery done on Monitor as something of a guide, there is ultimately the fact that her hull state is probably in a fairly fragile condition at this stage. The turrets will be absolutely fine. They've been mostly out of the water. As you can see, while they have a lot of surface rust, it wouldn't take a huge amount to clear them up. And she ultimately is being held together at this point largely by those massive slabs of iron that make up her belt armor, her breastwork armor, and of course the turret structure itself. But I think given that she has gone through a couple of stages of minor structural collapse, the idea of lifting the wreck entire and taking her away to be preserved and displayed elsewhere would probably cause the further collapse of the wreck. Now, there are two possible ways I can foresee for preservation going forwards, one of which would be to remove the turrets and possibly the breastwork structure itself as well, as they seem to be the bits that are probably in the best condition. Those could be removed and much more easily maintained, but of course that would involve disassociating parts of the ship from other parts of the ship, and the hull would probably be left to rot away over the next few decades, which would be a little bit of a shame. The other method, although both methods would be quite expensive, but the other method which could possibly be done, which would be more expensive but would preserve more of the ship as a whole, would be, as you can see, the water around this area where she is not exactly that deep, and as you saw from the shot of where the pier is, you're not actually that far away from land either. So what could be done would be to build essentially a caisson around the ship, raise it high enough to deal with tides and storms and everything, and have to make it fairly strong as well. And as long as the caisson goes deep enough as well, you could then potentially drain the interior and treat the ship, prop it up, do whatever structural repairs were needed, etc., in place. Possibly even putting a roof over it if you wanted to make it fully climate controlled. And then you extend that little pier that we were standing on in order for visitors to come and see her. Now, yes, that would be expensive, but it is quite easily within the realms of physical possibility. Engineering-wise, the calculations are actually not that difficult. The main downside, of course, would be then the bulk of the ship is once again self-supporting in air, whereas at the moment it's partly supported by the water, and that could risk further collapse. So further work would have to be done in analysing the ship's hull to see if it could actually survive being in the open air environment like that. But even if you didn't want to drain it, I think an enclosed caisson of some sort would, of course, stop the wind and the waves getting at her, the local bird life and so forth. And so even if you just had static water helping to support her, it would preserve her for a considerably longer period of time. So that's another option. But of course, everything of this nature is down to funding and the willingness of the government, in this case, to provide that funding, and an engineering company to come up with the detailed solutions. But for now, until something dramatic happens either way, if you do want to see the last remaining British-built Monitor, or coastal defence ship, or however you want to term it, then, well, head down to Melbourne if you happen to be in Australia. Well, or if you don't happen to be in Australia, she's still in the same location. But either way, you can have a drive down, have a look. There's that pier, top left corner. So a decent zoom camera will get you some fairly decent photos. They don't seem to mind small-scale drones either. The seabirds actually, unlike most Australian wildlife, didn't seem to take too much objection to a small drone. And as I said, as long as you get decent weather, you should be fairly safe operating it. And if you get the requisite permissions, you can even go down and have a look at those 10-inch guns, because they're just next to the wreck. And so that wraps up our little look at the two main wrecks that you can go and have a look at off of Melbourne, Australia. Thank you very much once again to everybody who enabled this to happen, especially those of you who backed the Australian trip, and, of course, our wonderful Australian chauffeur and guide in the Melbourne area. And as with the J7 footage, although this has all been rendered down to 1080p for YouTube purposes, all of the drone footage is in 4K. There's plenty more stills from the drone footage as well, individual photos taken in 4K. So if you happen to be researching the wreck, Cerberus, or just generally want to have a look in more detail, again, drop me a line and I will happily provide you with the full set of images and videos. Thanks for watching, and see you again in another video.